Ladies and gentlemen, I also would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet here today, the Whadjuk Noongar people, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. My name is Kristen Tilley. I'm Australia's Climate Change Ambassador, and can I also begin by thanking the event organisers of this Indian Ocean Conference, being the India Foundation and the Perth US Asia Centre, for hosting this conference here in beautiful Perth on the shores of the Indian Ocean. Apologies, this is what happens when you rely on technology and your fingers move around a little. So I'm very pleased to be moderating today's panel discussion on climate change and the energy transition. Of course, this discussion comes at a critical time. I, like many of you, paid particular attention to the outcomes of the recent COP28 climate meeting in Dubai in December. And I think you would all agree the outcomes were significant. Over 190 countries agreed that renewable energy is our future. These countries agreed to contribute to a tripling of global renewable energy by 2030, and in a historic first, also agreed to transition away from fossil fuels in energy systems to achieve net zero by 2050. We also learned from the first global stocktake under the Paris Agreement that while much progress has been made, the world must accelerate our efforts to keep the 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature goal within reach. The importance of taking stronger global action to tackle climate change has been reinforced by the UN Secretary-General. He has said that we are in fact entering an era of global boiling, with 2023 being the hottest year on record by a margin. And as many of you would know all too well, the Indian Ocean region is home to some of the countries most vulnerable to climate change. Indeed, climate change is already endangering human health, food security, biodiversity, economic development and the social stability of our countries, particularly with Indian Ocean countries having large populations and many vulnerable lands. And of course, the Indian Ocean region is very diverse, including small island states, least developed countries, major emerging economies and developed nations such as Australia. Despite this diversity, we share many of the same challenges of the energy transition, which means that by working together, we can better harness solutions. If done properly, harnessing our shared knowledge and contributions, the energy transition will provide opportunities to reduce greenhouse gas emissions faster and more efficiently, while ensuring a secure, sustainable and affordable supply of energy for all. This can help our countries meet our climate and energy goals while also meeting important social and economic needs, driving growth and development in a less costly and more predictable way. And that's what today's discussion is about. Speaking of today's panel discussion, we've unfortunately been beset with some late cancellations from our previously confirmed panellists due to delayed flights and illness. So we had to quickly adapt and innovate last night, and I'm immensely grateful that two of the speakers before you today have agreed to do so, to join our panel at very, very late notice, and I greatly appreciate that willingness. You also may notice that at the end there's one empty chair left, and that we're suffering a little bit from gender imbalance on the panel. So here's where some of the innovation comes in. If there's any females, participants in the audience that think that they can contribute valuable insights and views to today's panel discussion on climate and clean energy, please feel free to come up and take my left-hand side chair at any point during the panel discussion, and we will introduce you and seek your views. But to kick off our discussion, I'm pleased to be joined by four eminent regional leaders to hear their perspectives of the impact of climate change across our region and how we can work together to drive a just regional energy transition that keeps the Paris Agreement goals alive. I will take my seat shortly. I'll introduce one at a time the panellists and then immediately pose an introductory question to them for them to respond, and then work my way through the panel. We'll see if there's an additional panellist before I get to the end of the row. I'll engage a little bit more as moderator to see if there's anything obvious of follow-up before, towards the end of the panel discussion, I will open up for audience questions, so please feel free that you'll have your opportunity to ask something of the panel. Okay, 2 seconds, thanks. You can still hear? Thank you. Our first speaker to my left is Ambassador Anil Truganayat. Ambassador Truganayat is a career diplomat with 3 decades serving India's national interests across Asia, Africa, Europe and the Americas, including Russia and the United States. He has been a visiting fellow at Oxford University, where he conducted research on WTO and regional trading blocs, and is currently a distinguished fellow at the Vivekananda International Foundation. So Ambassador Truganayat, let's start as the first speaker with some big picture contextual questions. In the margins of the G20 last year, the leaders of India, the United States, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, France, Italy, Germany and the EU announced their ambition around a new maritime and overland connectivity corridor between Asia and Europe. This is a bold vision to create a corridor crossing regions and countries that are in the crossfire of global strategic, political, economic, and at times religious tensions. Transforming the global economy to support a transition to net zero is also a bold and grand vision that will require many of the same levels of ambition and cooperation. It requires real and urgent action now to succeed. So, Ambassador, what insights can you share with us about uniting the world and the region together in this global endeavour?
Thank you, Ambassador, and I'm really thankful that I've been part of this after attending Dhaka Summit last year. This is a very important initiative, and let us look at it this way, that India was a global maritime power at one time. It had a maritime connectivity with the world. It has always looked for connectivity, whether it is through the land connectivity, maritime connectivity, or others with the rest of the world. That's a global vision. And it is in that context that this new corridor that is called IMEC came about. It is basically, it was supposed to be the shortest, but it is fraught with a lot of geopolitics, as we know, which has further been accentuated due to the ongoing Israel-Hamas war. When we saw that the Abraham Accords will be expanded, Saudi Arabia will normalize relations with Israel, as was there. But today, once again, we see the Palestinian issue is on the forefront, and the Arab history discharge. So there is a little bit of a, I would say, a delay, and not necessarily it going forward in the speed at which the leaders wanted at that time. But at the same time, if you come to think of it, India is continuing with its program of beefing up the ports and others in this region which could connect. UAE has already committed to that. Saudi Arabia on its part is doing it. Now it is how do we connect? And we are already very close strategic partners with Israel. And the Haifa port, as you know, is also currently one of the Indian companies is there. And we have the Greeks where it will go eventually, are our strategic partners. The Prime Minister is expected to visit India soon. So I think that this is a very, very important initiative. But let us not only limit ourselves to that this was the only initiative. There has been International North-South Transport Corridor. There is a Chabahar Port initiative that has been going on. So India has been looking at connectivity. And very often it is being pitted as if it is something against the BRI or to counter the BRI. Competition is always there. But at the end of the day, whatever be the strategic goals, any corridor will only succeed if the businesses find it useful. And since it was going to be closed, and we had, as you know, the West Asia is our closest, most strategic neighborhood. And India is dependent for its energy security, for its economic heft, as well as for its diaspora, which is the 9 billion. So I think that from our point of view, this is a natural extension to this. We are connected with them, they are our largest partners, and I think that this will go ahead. But we'll have to just ride over the geopolitical dimensions of it.
Can I ask a follow-up question just around your involvement and observations in that broader G20 initiative and what it might mean in terms of, and I think the key point you raise is really relevant here, connectivity around countries in our region connecting to speed up the energy transition. Is there any advice you'd give around that?
Well, let me try to say that when I was in Dhaka last time, one of the points that stuck to me was that one of the ministers mentioned that oceans are crying. And that is something we need to be careful about. And we cannot just think in terms of, because we don't live in silos, we act in silos. That is the biggest problem. We are acting in defiance of the natural logic, the way we are thinking that we are going to find some planet B, or we'll have a plan B. There is no plan B, no planet B. We'll have to eventually live here or perish here. So the choice is very limited. So it is a common sense. Just now we are hearing that you are an indigenous country where indigenous people have such wide wisdom. In India, Prime Minister Modi came up with this idea of lifestyle for environment. Learn to live with the life, learn to breathe with nature. And that is something in Asia is so common. So, but at the end of the day, there are many complicated issues. One of the major issues I would say is the financing. How do you green the place? How do you find the finances? Everybody commits and nobody delivers. There is a problem with regard to responsibilities. I mean, how are you going to apportion the responsibility, whether the polluter pays principle applies or not? That is something we need to ask ourselves, even if that is not true. So we cannot be just sitting there. I remember that, very famous Nobel laureate Tagore, Rabindranath Tagore, he said, Ekla chalo re. So, Ekla please, let's go alone if nobody else comes along. So it is for us, IOC community, I think, we need to find ways. There are best practices in India, in Australia, in different countries. Every country has certain best practices. Can we try to amalgamate those practices for a mutual benefit? It is a common sense thing, but we are not doing that. For example, Prime Minister Modi launched this initiative with France, ISA, International Solar Alliance. We had now, as a G20, we saw the Global Biofuels Alliance that came up. There are umpteen number of initiatives, and we do have certain technology. Let us try to reinvest into that, try to adapt it. And I think that what is most important in our own region is, it was mentioned by Minister Watts about that we can't do much about the Sino-US competition. Unfortunately, both of them happen to be the violators of the basic fundamental principles of rules of the game, whether it is UNCLOS or whether it is aggression or hegemony. Now that is where there is no trust. There is tremendous trust deficit that needs to be overcome. And unless we do that, we'll continue to have the COPs, the conferences and everything, and we'll come up with reports which will not be acted upon.
Thank you. I think we might hopefully come back, if not in this panel, in others, about that really important issue of trust. Thanks, Ambassador. I'll now move to our next speaker, Mr. Phil Midland. Mr. Midland is President of IHS International LLC, a global consulting firm specialising in strategic assessment and advisory services. Mr. Midland has supported the US government on political and infrastructure assessments, and he has also led corporate initiatives in China, including electrical power production, wireless communication, industrial construction, and transport development. Mr. Midland, the Indian Ocean spans Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. It is fundamental to global trade, energy security, and economic prosperity. With your experience leading corporate infrastructure ventures and providing strategic assessments, what do you think are the core principles that should be considered to guide Indian Ocean region leaders and policymakers as they develop and implement pathways to net zero?
Well, thank you, and appreciate my colleagues here. And I'm sorry to say this is only my 6th IOC. I wasn't at 7, but I've been to 6 of them, and I'm very, very honored to be asked to come back. And this is my first time in Perth, and it's lovely to be here. So thank you. My professional legacy is Navy, United States Navy. My colleague on the panel here is from Bahrain, and Bahrain happened to be my first duty station 50 years ago. in the U.S. Middle East Force, the predecessor of the now Fifth Fleet. So I have sailed the waters, navigated the waters of the Indian Ocean many times. Been to most of the countries of the littoral of the Indian Ocean. In our show the flag, in our security of the seas, in our cooperation with various nations. So in that way, what I want to present to you today is a context. And I think this is, no. Okay. I hope you can see that. But some things have been just said by the ambassador and others, and this is about connectivity. Clearly, this panel is about global warming and climate change. But what are some other drivers? What are cascading effects of this? And that's what I just want to take a few minutes to go through the context. In this era of technology, which gives us data in unimaginable ways, we have forming what are called DAOs, and I hope you can see this slide. DAO means decentralized autonomous organizations. I was given the charter by the master of our Office of Net Assessment 10 years ago in the Pentagon, Mr. Andrew Marshall. I was given by him the assignment to look at the reconfiguration of Asia in the technology world. And not where are borders, that's not the issue. But what is technology going to do for reconfiguration of the whole region? So in this way, I'm looking at the Indian Ocean as a decentralized autonomous organization. And people are well familiar with the ancient trade routes, various names, but this depicts the Silk Route. And then one that I'm sure you're all aware of, but most people just aren't aware of, is it was the Dutch, actually, that through the VOC established the maritime trade routes depicted here. And so then you get what we're facing today, and this is the classic land versus maritime. And I call it man, maritime, Mackinder, land. And I think we could have many very active discussions about what's going on in the world today, but the fundamentals of it is various factors reset, reconfigure trade routes. So this is just a depiction of that, this is Mackinder here. But so one thing that in the context of a DAO, decentralized autonomous organization, one thing that, and in the context of global warming and climate change, I ask people to pay attention to what is this Eurasian Economic Union. One can look at it as a political issue of China, Central Asia, Japan, or China, Central Asia, and Russia. But if you look at it as a DAO, a decentralized autonomous organization, you're going to get a very interesting result of connectivity. Then you get, because of climate change, the northern routes are now open. And the opening of the northern routes, the Arctic routes, and the fact that the Russians do have the means to keep it open with the nuclear icebreakers, this is going to bring change and adjustment to trade patterns. So you get the Arctic routes, you get the EAEU, the land routes, and then of course you have the Indian Ocean established routes. Then the ambassador already brought up the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative. This is now a 11-year-old initiative from China. to reestablish the land-based routes, and more in a digital environment. So you get something that starts to look like what you see in the map here, and with technology, this is advancing rapidly. I happen to be very familiar with China. That's just what I do. I served as the U.S. Naval Attaché in China for 7 years in the 1980s. And when people talk of high-speed rail, I think you need to go visit China today. Because yes, the trains are going 350 kilometers per hour across country and up and down. And recently, as many of you may know, the Chinese just last year, and this is to somebody who is in the Vietnam War, as a young person, I find it unbelievable that there is now high-speed rail between Kunming, China, and Vientiane. Unbelievable that Laos has high-speed rail. So, but it gives you an indicator where this is going. So how do we fold this context into survivability, sustainability, stability? Because not just because of climate change, but because of new options with technology, things are changing. And this brings in the whole virtual issue. 2 years ago in Abu Dhabi, I just raised the issue of statecraft in the metaverse. This is going to bring a requirement for a new type of political thought and politician. Don't need to get into all of this, but various people are already acting. You bring up finance. The carbon credit financial systems, which are being created, and some of your countries are actually rich in carbon credit. But who's going to be the referee? Who's going to determine? Who's going to do the surveillance and accountability of your carbon credits to stabilize the finance system? And then we get Xi Jinping, and President Xi is saying, we're connecting a new world. And I just think that map is a good way to look at it. So we hear a lot about AI, ChatGPT. Again, we have a Western version. This is ChatGPT. Then you get to the Eastern version. Similar technologies, two different approaches. We have to be very mindful of the context and how this is driving change, especially trade patterns, interconnection, and geopolitics. This is, I don't know if you're familiar with this is the Arabic version of the GPT. And then G42, which is from the UAE. So, and then we get into the non-fungible tokens. And this is the Tao of Islam. This exists. So just no matter where you reach, the technologies are having impact. And finally, I'll get into this because this is a picture of the top quantum and AI experts of China, together with Mr. Cai Qi. Mr. Cai Qi is on the standing committee of the Communist Party of China. He was literally at the right hand of Xi Jinping at the recent summit with President Biden. Not one newspaper mentioned this gentleman's name because they don't know him. But this gentleman is really the coordinator of massive intellectual power of AI and quantum. So again, things to be aware of, not to fear, but to take into account. And that's what they call the collective intelligence project. This is going to have deep effect on green finance, on trade routes. And so then we do get into the supply chain, geopolitical and spiritual reconfiguration, which the gentleman here from Australia at the opening, I was very impressed and very pleased that we had his opening. So I ended by saying in a context, just think of it, we have now a digital great state. And we need to find a way to synchronize it, keep it stable, and now getting the politicians, the political people, the financial people, understanding that we're going to be interacting in very different ways. And so I hope that helps put some context on that.
No, absolutely. Thanks very much, Phil, for that again, big picture, what's the strategic context that we need to be aware of. Wonderful. Thank you, Kate. I've had a willing female join our panel. Let me move now to Dr. Tony Warby. Dr. Warby was appointed as the inaugural Chief Scientist at the Minderoo Foundation, a philanthropic organisation here in Perth, in November last year. But before moving to Minderoo, which is in the philanthropic sector, as I said, Dr. Warby was Director of the Oceans and Atmosphere Division at the CSIRO, which is Australia's premier scientific and industrial research organisation, and CEO of the Antarctic Climate and Ecosystems Cooperative Research Centre. He's served in an advisory capacity to state and federal governments here in Australia, including as co-chair of the World Climate Research Programme's Cryosphere and Climate Programme. If it's not obvious to you, many Australians will be very familiar that Dr. Warby is known as one of the eminent leading climate scientists, not just in Australia, but in the world. So Dr. Warby, you're a scientist, a climate scientist. You've worked for eminent public research institutions and are now working for a miner and philanthropist here in Perth, one who is committed to net zero, or as Andrew Forrest, that philanthropist and miner, will say, real zero. So given your deep expertise and background, what would you suggest are the roles for government, for business and philanthropy in the climate and energy transition?
Thanks, Kristen, and thank you everyone for being here today. Unlike Phil, this is my first Indian Ocean conference, and as a Perth local, a very warm welcome to Perth in more ways than one. I don't know what temperatures you've come from, but it's pretty warm here, even by Perth summer standards. I work in the philanthropic sector now, as Kristen mentioned, but I'd like to point out right at the beginning that the funding that supports our philanthropy, Minderoo Foundation, does come from profits from iron ore mining. And those iron ore mines currently burn about 1 billion litres of diesel a year. So that's a very high carbon emission activity. And you might well ask, why on earth, as a climate scientist, would I be working for an organisation that is funded in that way? The answer is that our founder and chairman has committed to eliminating that diesel use by 2030. 1 billion litres of diesel will no longer be burnt in his mining operations by 2030. And his ambition is to transform that company into a green energy company, effectively, through investment in renewables, massive investment in green hydrogen, decarbonising his shipping fleet, ultimately. That's not going to happen by 2030, but all of the trucks, all of the trains, already there's an infinity train that basically generates enough electricity going downhill to the port to charge the batteries to take it back up to the mines. So there's already been some massive investments, and I think to come to your question, Christian, what's the role of business, first of all? It's to innovate in that kind of way, to be ambitious, to take risks, and to really, ultimately you're serving your customers and your shareholders, but if you're doing a whole lot of damage to the climate system in the process, then it's taking a very short-term view of what is ultimately in their best interests. And so I think all business leaders listen to the science, think about the products that you're producing, thinking about your customers ultimately and your long-term profitability, and be aware of the risks that are going to affect your business, and to act as early as possible to ensure that those risks are ultimately dealt with. In relation to government, at a very philosophical level, the role of government is to look after the welfare of its citizens. I don't really know what else government is for. That is fundamentally what government is there for, which means government also has to be thinking about what are the risks to the welfare of its citizens and how do you address them? How do you ensure that those risks ultimately don't impact the welfare of your citizens? And chief among the risks that affect citizens everywhere is climate change. And so I do think the role of government very much is to be aware of the challenge that climate change is going to pose, both at a local region, at a state level here in Australia, at a federal level, but also to be a good global citizen and to understand what's going on in the region. And in the context of this conference, I think the gathering of minds around how climate change will impact other Indian Ocean countries is critically important. So this idea of collaboration across government to ensure that there's some consistency in approach, some testing of each other's thinking, to get the policy settings right, because that's really where government and business intersect. Business want certainty in policy. We hear that constantly from business. They would rather have a regulation they don't like than no regulation, but the threat that something might come down the track. So I do think that's also an incredibly important role for government. And then, of course, where responding to climate change requires a transition, whether it be to renewable energy away from coal, which is very much the case in Australia, we have to be very clear about what the transition pathways are. Change is hard. Change can be scary. Change is something that frightens a lot of people. I think it's a human trait not to be very excited about change. And so when change is thrust upon you, there's a tendency to push back on it or to pretend it's not required. And so this is where leadership just is so important. Leadership at a business level, leadership at a government level, character in leadership. If my chairman was sitting here, he would say we've got plenty of capital, we don't need more capital. We've got, all of the resources in the world. What we need is character in leadership. And I think that's as true in business as it is in government. The third part, I guess, is what role does philanthropy play? And philanthropy can fill gaps, much needed gaps. A lot of philanthropists are risk takers. Many of them are very successful business leaders and achieve their wealth as a result of taking risks in business. That's certainly the true of our founder. Philanthropic dollars will only be a drop in the ocean of what is required to solve the world's problems, but it can be catalytic in the way that it's deployed. It can take higher risk. It can be deployed as grants in the form of tied or untied funding to organisations that are doing good work. It can invest in innovation. It can fund scientific research that is unlikely to be funded by other organisations or national funding bodies, simply because it is higher risk. A lot of those funding bodies, at least the ones I'm aware of around the world, tend to be a little bit risk averse sometimes. If you're going to put public funds into something, there's a tendency to want a little bit of certainty or at least lower risk in how that is deployed. And of course, the other way that philanthropic capital can be deployed is as high-risk first-loss investments. And we can do that alongside development banks. We can do it in partnership with other philanthropic organisations, for example. And we can de-risk the early stage of innovation or the early stage of some kind of, whatever it is in terms of, say, an alternative to plastic or an alternative to fish meal or whatever it might be. Some of the challenges that we face as a philanthropy, which we'll come to in later questions, but providing that catalytic capital can de-risk those projects for more capital to be crowded in that is looking, that has to make a return. And ideally, when we think about making nature investable, I'm an environmental scientist at heart, so one of my real, one of the things that I'm really trying to pursue is this idea of how you make nature investable. How do you attract the necessary capital into nature-based solutions and ensure that there's a return for things like pension funds and other things that have literally billions of dollars that they can invest. So there's lots of ways that business, government and philanthropy can be working together in this space. I think the thread, though, that really joins those three sectors is leadership. And that's just so fundamentally important if we're going to have a better world to live in.
Thanks very much, Tony. If you wouldn't mind if I could just ask a quick follow-up question. I think the role of philanthropy in the clean energy transition, as you said, will only be a small part, but an important part because of that ability to leverage. What in your opinion, and I very much acknowledge your point that philanthropists will be individual and have different backgrounds that put them in the position that they're in, but is there a particular common thing that motivates philanthropists to put their money and lean into the climate and clean energy transition challenge?
So I think philanthropy it's very personal, I would say. Most philanthropists invest in causes that are near and dear to their heart. That's particularly true for philanthropists with a relatively small amount of capital to invest. Most of them will prefer to go deep on a particular issue than broad on a whole range of issues and put their resources into something they're passionate about. And that might be through lived experience. I know in the case of our founders, lived experience in relation to modern slavery has driven a big program of work. Lived experience in relation to early childhood education and some of the challenges in Australia has driven a big commitment to that work. And our founder as well, Andrew Forrest, is so deeply passionate about the oceans that's driven a big commitment there. So I think as a philanthropic organisation gets bigger, they've got more capital to deploy. Obviously there's opportunity for a greater scope of work. I think the way we think about it at Minderoo is we think of climate change really as a threat multiplier. We have three key beneficiaries that we serve: vulnerable communities, gender equality and oceans. And every single problem that we are trying to address for those beneficiaries is made worse by climate change. And so we're putting a climate lens over our entire portfolio to say, if we're investing in a community housing program, it needs to be climate positive. If we're working with a community to improve the way that it manages its fisheries, it needs to be climate positive. We're doing a lot of work in the plastic space. If plastic was a country, it would have the same emissions through its production as the UK. So that, again, is a link between addressing what is an environmental issue from a plastic pollution perspective, but also has a massive carbon footprint. And so I think wherever you look, climate touches just about everything that we're trying to address from a philanthropic perspective.
Wonderful. Thanks very much, Tony. I'll now call on Dr. Abdullah Isa Alabisi. Dr. Alabisi is a leading renewable energy academic and engineer. He's widely published in international peer-reviewed journals and has authored a number of publications on international cooperation in the net zero transition. Dr. Alabisi is the Director of the Energy and Environment Program at the Bahrain Centre for Strategic, International and Energy Studies. So Dr. Alabasi, with your experience in energy connectivity, can I ask, in a region where there are significant pockets of energy poverty, how do we ensure small communities have access to energy in a just transition to net zero?
So first of all, thank you for the nice introductions and to be in this wonderful panel with different backgrounds. And it's always nice to have this sort of discussions, especially that people having different view from different discipline, and we see how the things is interconnected somehow. I always start that when we start to talk about environment, we found ourselves interconnected, and sometimes, and in most occasions, I found also we are interconnected even through the panel. So my colleague mentioned his time in Bahrain, and we find the connections. And this is exactly what's happened with the environment and climate change. When we think about climate change, if one nation doing better than the other nation, collectively we will see the impact on the environment. So we have to be interconnected and have collective effort to work in climate change subjects. So discussing climate change, it has to be an effort for everyone, and we have to think in different dimensions. So Dr. Tony mentioned that the role of the government and also the business environment of having the business model of supporting the initiatives or renewable energy or net zero emissions. I would like, before I address the question, is to highlight another also role which is very important, which is the community itself, and it's associated to my question. We need to think that the problem of climate change is not about the government and business communities, also about the social community, people participation. And to think about that, if you define the sustainability in the way that the UN look at the sustainability, we found social and environmental and economic dimensions together. And the social dimension is how people actually live and how they participate in that. So there is no a dedicated responsibility for one part over the other part. It's a mutual responsibility for all the communities or all the people to be involved in that. Returning back to the question, which is very, very also critical and interrelated with different sectors. When we are talking about energy transition or how we can address the climate change, as I mentioned in the beginning, we cannot distinguish between rich and poor communities in the way that we have all to address these issues because it's interconnected, but definitely the impact, it's different from region and the other. But overall, we have to think in two dimensions. The first one is to look to the community itself and to see what we call it the hotspots. In life cycle assessment, when we do life cycle assessment to any part, we start to identify the hotspot. The hotspot, what we mean by the hotspot is that where is the emissions is actually generated. And you will find something very impressive when you start to see that. We found in some studies that the conventional tracks is much better than EV tracks. When we start to have life cycle assessment from cradle to grave, we see the emissions over all of EV cars is more than traditional tracks. And this study is conducted in Spain. We have to take the context in that. So this case study is covering specific context, and we have to study exactly what is the hotspot of every community if we are looking to develop something, comprehensive solution within this community. The second thing also to consider is to play on the strength you have. And I can give example from my region. In Arabic Gulf countries, we have hydrocarbons resources. And we see the energy transition is not through getting rid of hydrocarbons. We see the energy transition has to be through hydrocarbons, and because of that we have several initiatives associated with circular carbon economy. In King Abdullah Research Institute, we start to have carbon circular economy, and we are talking about how we keep our carbon as a friend, not an enemy. It's a different way. It's not the European way of, let's put it like that, of getting rid of hydrocarbons. And we see also American institutions share the same interest with us through the G20. So we have to play in our strength. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. We have to see what the strength we have and we have to see the energy transition through our strength and to find the most environmental solution through our industry. Oil and gas industry in our region for more than 100 years. Why we get rid of it? But we have to work with it, and we have to develop it, and at the same time, we have to bring renewable energy to the picture. And also, we have to think about different type of hydrogens, and this is exactly what's happened in our region. Oman now, they have very ambitious target in green hydrogen, utilizing renewable energy, and having more discussion about the carbon capture. So I share with my colleague also about the technology advancement. So utilizing the technology for addressing the environment is something also crucial, and it's very important to look at that in a more comprehensive way. The last point also I would like to mention how these community actually can develop strategic plans or pathways of energy transition, as well as addressing the climate change challenges, is to look to the diplomacy in the way that having a better connections with your neighbor, and this is exactly what this conference is promoting. You have to find a mutual interest between the countries around you, and to start to build connections and the right example around the region. And this is also something we have to learn from European Union. European Union is the greatest, or maybe the only unique union in the world in the way that has shared their own interest. And when you study the European Union history, you will see that it's built in mutual interest, and at the same time looking at the energy. And we learn also from European Union is you have to search for the right partner. Because of the Ukraine conflict, we see how the crash happened in the energy markets in Europe. So we have to learn from European Union two lessons. The first one is to search for your mutual interests as a countries, and the second one is very important to look to your partner and to pick the right one.
Thank you very much, Abdullah, for those contributions. If I could ask you a quick follow-up question in terms of, much like Australia, you represent or you live in a country with deep fossil fuel intensive industry, set up an economy that has been in place for many, many decades. But I acknowledge the point you made about we've got to lean into the transition, but look at where we've come from, not as an enemy, but a friend in going forward. I guess one of the early comments that this panel made was around the energy transition can actually help improve energy security and sovereignty of nations where there might be risk of conflict, which traditionally has been driven by access to traditional fossil fuels. Do you think, you mentioned hydrogen as being one of the key opportunities, renewable-based hydrogen going forward. That arguably will still be a traded commodity between nations. Do you think it has different characteristics around its energy security and sovereignty aspects than traditional oil, gas and coal?
So first of all, if you start to think about the energy security, which is very important, especially for a specific region, and definitely the Gulf countries, GCC countries, is looking at that is one of the crucial things to explore, and always we have a lot of discussion around it. Definitely you have to think how you diversify your resources in the way that you don't overlook any resources. So, for instance, now last week we have a conference in Kuwait, and the conference was about the nuclear energy, and even to consider nuclear energy as a source of option for the GCC. We have 3 reactors now in Emirates. Saudi have their own also technology, and the discussion now even within the GCC why we don't to invest in the small modular reactors as part of diversifying the energy resources. By having diversified energy resources, you can have a lot of benefits. The first benefit, energy security. The second thing also, these type of resources will create a lot of momentum within the region about the technology deployment and technology applications. The third one also, you build on your own experience into that, and you will find that we are living in very interconnected, interrelated worlds, and you have to start to build your own way of a strategy that you rely on independence and sovereignty in the way that you put all the alliance in the way that you leverage the resources you have, and at the same time you can play in energy diplomacy in more positive way by having all this technology, and you build up in your, as I mentioned also in my first contribution, you have to search for your strength and you build up on that. And I think if we look the experience of developed countries in the way that it's very important to look to every options and keep always the door open for other options. And by the way, by mentioning hydrogen, we are looking that hydrogen has been in the region for a long time, actually. In oil and gas industry, we have gray and blue hydrogen, and it's in the region for more than 30 years, so it's not something new for our region. But now there are other colors, which is always very nice to have more colors. So we have green, we have even pink hydrogen, which is associated with nuclear applications. So it's always nice, as I mentioned, when you start to have the resources and you start to have the knowledge and you build up on that, definitely it will have a more positive impact in your pathway for the energy transition. One point also to highlight, I found it very important. This technology, because I have engineering background, I spent my sabbatical last year in the United States in UT Austin, and I have a great opportunity to work with high-tech technologies and researchers in the United States. I always see that there is no challenge with the technology. The technology has been around even for hydrogen since 70s. We are talking about different applications in 60s and 70s. So there is no issue with the technology itself. The issue is with to find the business model which we can actually implement this technology. And definitely when there is motivation for the market, the advancement will be more in this side. So we have to think, the problem now is to find, as also my colleague mentions, when we are talking about carbon market and carbon credit, is to find the right business model to adopt these technologies. But the technologies are there, and we can utilize them. And even solar and wind technology has been for a long time around, and all these applications, hydrogen applications, all of these applications have been around for a long time.
Thank you. Sounds very much, I think it made me think that, reminded me, of course, that every country has its own path to net zero, and different markets will be motivated by different technologies and energy supplies. So the best possible solution is diversifying that supply offering for your own national energy security, but also of the markets that you might serve. All right, our bonus panellist, Kate O'Shaughnessy from the Perth US Asia Centre. Thank you very much for taking the challenge and coming up and joining the panel. Of course, I don't have a preset question for you, but look, why don't I just throw to you, given what you've heard to date, and provide us your insights. Perhaps I should just give you a little bit further introduction of what I know of you. So Dr. O'Shaughnessy, as I said, works for the Perth US Asia Centre, but prior to that has been an experienced Australian diplomat, including in many of the Indian Ocean countries that we're referring to. So what insights would you like to contribute, Kate?
Well, thanks very much, Ambassador, and thank you for letting me take the challenge. It's a pleasure to join this very esteemed panel. What I do want to say from the outset is that I'm joining colleagues who have really deep scientific experience. I'm a former Australian High Commissioner to Mauritius, Seychelles, Ambassador to Comoros and Madagascar, I don't bring scientific expertise, but I did want to pick up on what Dr. Warby talked about, which is the idea of collaboration. Because as you said, Ambassador, I've also been an Australian diplomat for almost 20 years, and I don't know science, but I do know collaboration. And that's really the perspective that I wanted to share, particularly thinking about small island developing states. And I got a really difficult but important insight into the stake that small island developing states have in climate change during my time in Mauritius and in the Western Indian Ocean. We're at a conference where we are seeking to learn from each other and collaborate. And what I wanted to encourage everyone to do during their time at this conference is, especially for my colleagues, I see many of you here today and in the other room from Western Indian Ocean island states, to connect with colleagues from the Pacific. And let me explain why. So, Ambassador, you will know very well that Australia works very, very closely with Pacific Island states to advance their challenges that they're facing in climate change and help them to adapt to that. My observation as an Australian Foreign Service employee is that Pacific Island states have excellent regional architecture. They have very good systems to collaborate and put on the world stage the concerns they have about climate change. I would say, as a general comment, that it is thanks to small island states from the Pacific, from the Caribbean, from the Indian Ocean, that the world has seized upon and understood the severity of the climate change problem. It is thanks to them. And it is those states that are facing the worst impacts of climate change. So what I would like to see out of this conference is not only that Pacific Island states and Western Indian Ocean island states talk to each other, because I think there's much that Indian Ocean island states can learn from Pacific Island states' experience of advocacy. I would also like to see everyone at this conference listening to the perspectives of both Pacific Island states and Western Indian Ocean states. Let me add one more point on that, because I think this is a key challenge for island states in the Indian Ocean. Unlike the Pacific Island states, Indian Ocean states, island states are so very different. Seychelles, Madagascar, Comoros, Mauritius, different historical trends, different cultures, different languages. And so it becomes more difficult for them to, I think, advocate on the world stage for their interests. Some of them have already graduated from aid eligibility, and so they fall under the radar of the international community's attention. But they are no less impacted by the existential threat of climate change. So that's a brief overview of what I think I would like to see come out of this conference, and I do think that gatherings like this, where we bring representatives from ministerial level down across the Indian Ocean, are so important for us to hear each other's perspectives and to learn from them. So my takeaway message is that I do want everyone to make sure that you seek out the island state representatives from both the Pacific and the Indian Ocean here today. Je vois qu'il y a des amis de Madagascar. Je vous invite à faire une intervention si vous voulez. I'd like the colleagues from Madagascar, who are experiencing one of the world's worst climate change induced droughts in the south of their country, if they feel brave to make an intervention, either in French or English. I see colleagues from Mauritius, I see colleagues from the Pacific. I know that you will have very, very important wisdom to share. And so I just wanted to take up your offer to take the stage and invite those colleagues to share their experience as well. Thank you.
Wonderful.